Morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 16th, 2021. Today I'm going to be discussing the insane rush for the Green New Deal. This is not just happening in the United States, this is a global phenomenon, and it's pushed by the leading promoters of globalization. Globalization meaning not involving the whole world in economic development and cooperation, but globalization meaning the imposition of rule from above, from supranational government agencies that are largely controlled and run by corporate cartels. This is what the Great Reset is. This is what the Green New Deal would be. That nations would not be allowed to act in their own sovereign interests, but instead put under new rules and regulations that are based on technocratic decisions for the benefit of corporations and cartels, not for the improvement of living standards of people in sovereign nation states. This is what we pointed out in the special report from the Executive Intelligence Review called The Great Leap Backwards. And it goes through the record that Lyndon LaRouche has in exposing the fraud of so-called climate change. That this is part of a 40 to 50 year transformation of Western economies from the model that came out after the end of World War II of technologically progressive industrial and agricultural economies, where the defining quality came from the determination to use increasingly energy flux dense methods of power production, which then transformed basic industry into much more productive enterprises by the virtue of the fact of using more power and increasing the productivity of labor. And that was the basis for the increase in the wealth production in the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s and early 80s, where the American worker and the Western European worker were highly productive, but productive in goods production. We've had a shift since 1971 into a speculative system, increasingly moving away from physical goods production into service sector and consumerism, and outsourcing the industry and manufacturing that used to characterize the strength of the American economic system. Now we're coming up with a series of events which are not just supported by the Biden administration, although the Biden administration is totally on board with this, but supported by the European Union very prominently, by green parties throughout Europe. These include a climate summit that's taking place in April, an upcoming biodiversity summit, and then the capping it off will be the November 1st convening of the next COP26 event summit, which will take place in Glasgow, Scotland. And this is what was set up by the Paris Climate Accord. The host for that will be British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who apparently has gone completely green, who's committed to using his platform of Global Britain to push two things: the climate change agenda, which will be to further turn the British Isles into a post-industrial rubbish heap, and at the same time put the British military into an eastward expansion, what the British used to call the East of Suez project, to put troops in the South China Sea, naval vessels there, to be part of the Asia NATO to contain Russia and China. Now, it's also been announced by Secretary of State Blinken and the climate envoy of the Biden administration, John Kerry, who, by the way, used to be Blinken's boss when Blinken served under him in the Obama administration in the State Department. Kerry and Blinken are talking about the number one issue in U.S. foreign policy is climate change. So you get a sense of what this drift looks like. Now, fortunately, I can tell you there's a great deal of resistance building to the Green New Deal. Internationally, the two major opponents are Russia and China. Now, you shouldn't be surprised by that. Both of these are nations that are trying to build their economies. The Russians, coming out of 70 years of communism, and then being put through the ringer with a shock therapy policy from the West, was trying to deindustrialize Russia. Instead, under Putin, he's committing the great crime of rebuilding Russian manufacturing, Russian technology, the space program, hypersonic weapon systems to defend the country, and an attempt to increase the population of Russia. Well, how dare he try to do that, act as a sovereign nationalist to improve his nation? And as a result, what Putin is committing Russia to is expanding coal production, especially so-called clean coal, and nuclear power. Same thing with China. Half the energy, the electricity production in China within less than a generation will come from nuclear and the other half from coal. And the nuclear side will increasingly incorporate the developments in nuclear fusion and plasma technologies. And at the same time, China and Russia are cooperating to build nuclear plants and coal plants in Africa. So you have a major opposition to the Green New Deal and the Great Reset coming from those two countries. That's one of the main reasons why there's a targeting of Putin in the US press, especially the last 4 years, and increasingly since 2020, a targeting of Xi Jinping in China, because they won't go along with the globalization policy of the Davos billionaires. Now, in the United States, we had the Great Texas Deep Freeze, which showed the unreliability and the inefficiency of so-called renewable energy sources, especially solar and wind. And yet the push is to ensure that that's the direction for the future. Well, 13 state attorneys general have filed a suit against the executive orders of the Biden administration, which essentially declare that the Green New Deal is the future for energy in the United States. The suit filed by the Missouri Attorney General and then backed by 12 other states is trying to overturn these executive orders. And it makes one point, which is that the president does not have the power to do this. It has to be done through the Congress if it's going to be done. But they're objecting to the fact that it will shut down manufacturing and agriculture, meaning job losses, revenue losses for the state in the realm of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. So this is a very serious legal challenge. Now in Texas, there's another bill that's coming out. Texas being, of course, the victim of the great deep freeze and these freezing up of the windmills. But also what they're proposing is a move to counter the compact of the bankers to stop lending to oil and gas companies, stop lending to so-called fossil fuel, coal. Any company that produces a so-called carbon footprint will be cut off from credit. This is what was organized by a coalition of bankers who are calling for a regime change, financial regime change. This is coming from people like Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, Larry Fink of BlackRock, the company that's the largest equity fund in the world. What they're saying is no credit should be made available to any industry or company that produces a carbon footprint. In other words, force deindustrialization by control of credit. Now, the Texas bill would counter this by saying that if banks and firms refuse to lend to oil and gas firms, then Texas public sector funds will be withdrawn and pulled out of those firms. This includes the Texas Permanent School Fund with $46 billion, the Texas Teacher Retirement System with $62 billion. So this also has some teeth to it, but it reflects a rebellion against the fake science that's behind global climate change based on man-made global warming. And then from Africa, finally, there's an op-ed in The Hill yesterday, or a couple of days ago, by the former Minister of Public Works of Liberia and a director at the Pro-Nuclear Breakthrough Institute, which is committed to providing nuclear power for African countries. They basically say economic growth in Africa will not be achieved by a blanket ban on fossil fuels. And they make the point that a blanket ban on the financing of fossil fuels will obstruct economic growth and at the same time do little to fight climate change. Uh, they say that with the solar and other renewable sources are nowhere sufficient to meet the needs of the continent, which include construction, building infrastructure, water management, and power. They say these areas remain dependent on oil and gas. Now, the reality in Africa is they're facing a mass starvation cycle, which is hit because of locusts, because of civil wars, because of other problems, but has affected East Africa, putting anywhere from 30 to 120 million people, including large numbers of children in East Africa, in danger of starvation. Now, this brings up an interesting question. In the United States, we see the so-called Black Lives Matter movement. Well, if Black Lives Matter, what about Africans? They're black. Do their lives not matter? Are we going to impose on them feudal systems based on financial needs of the international banks, which say we cannot afford to provide them with a decent living standard, with clean water, with power? Is that what we're going to do? If Black Lives Matter, don't those lives in Africa matter? The Black Lives Matter movement, if it were all serious, would be joining with the Schiller Institute, calling for a major effort to provide emergency food supplies to Africa and also to overthrow this nonsense of the Green New Deal and instead construct the kind of power that's necessary to develop the continent. I'll finish by just reminding you what Barack Obama said when he was challenged by South African students about wanting an American-style standard of living. Obama said, if you desire an American-style standard of living with a car, with a home, and so on, then the planet will boil over. In other words, saying to young people who wish to develop their nations that their desire to achieve a so-called middle-class standard of living will boil over the planet, will destroy life on the planet, which is what Kerry is saying, which is what the Davos crowd is saying. That's the nonsense that's in this global Green New Deal and the Great Reset. So get a hold of a copy of our report, The Great Leap Backwards, and join us to fight this. And sign up for our conference this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, the 20th and 21st of March. The conference of the Schiller Institute online. You can sign up on the schillerinstitute.com website and watch it for free. So join us then, and I'll see you again tomorrow.